Welcome back everyone to another reaction video. Well, as promised, we're going to dive back into Lemmino, who I think does absolutely fantastic work. And if you have any interest in historical documentaries whatsoever, go over right now and subscribe to him even before you watch this reaction video. I think that highly of. I've only seen a couple of his videos, but everything I've seen so far is top notch. The presentation's great. The research is well done. He documents everything, gives you a link to that, and narrates it well. Top-notch stuff, and I think most of you who have recommended Lemmino to me agree with that. So I've put a link in the description to the original of this. This is going to be a multi-part reaction. We're not going to do it all at once because the whole documentary is over an hour long. I've watched part of it. I haven't watched the whole thing. I just wanted to get a sense of it before I dove in. And what I've seen tells me this might be the definitive Jack the Ripper documentary on YouTube right now. I think that highly of it. And this is a topic I know a lot about. I've done research papers on in the past. I've got very strong opinions on who I think might be the killer, and I'll offer my own theories on that as we get to the end. Maybe even talk about it as we go into it. So I don't know how far we'll get today, but we're going to go ahead and get started. As always, I want to thank all of our patrons out there for your continued support. Let's go ahead and dive in.
In the late 19th century, the city of London was the largest in the world, a sprawling metropolis and a melting pot for trade, finance, and people. But in the autumn of 1888, an horrific story emerged from the capital's East End.
So we should set the stage here a little bit. This is what's known as the Victorian era because it's during the reign of Queen Victoria, who was on the throne for about 60 years, starting in, I think, 1837, going all the way to 1901 when she died and was succeeded by her son, Edward VII. This is a time when London is overcrowded and there's a lot of slums and a lot of people living in very poor conditions, a lot of immigrants in particular, much like was happening in the United States at this same time. You know, people think of New York City as being the hub of immigration, but London was seeing a lot of that as well. And London is, at this point, as he said, the largest city on earth. And Whitechapel, where all this goes down, is one of those, it's on the east side of London. It's one of those places where there's a lot of poor working class people, a lot of immigrants, a lot of prostitutes. I mean, a ton of prostitutes. And so it's kind of the perfect setting for something like this to take place. And if you want to get a really good glimpse of Victorian Whitechapel in 1888, I highly recommend the series Ripper Street. Stars Matthew Macfadyen, who's fantastic. If you've seen the show Succession, he plays an American, which is really weird to me after seeing him in his natural British state in Ripper Street. But check it out.
A story so dreadful, it sent shockwaves around the world. One after another, destitute women of the East End fell victim to a vicious killer known as Jack the Ripper. Despite an extensive manhunt and a few close calls, the Ripper was never caught.
And this is really cool. You see the Tower of London right here. And today everybody recognizes the Tower Bridge, which is the one a lot of people mistakenly call London Bridge. It's the one that has those towers on it and it's real distinct in London. It's right in that area where this happens. Whitechapel, where the murders take place, is like a mile away from the Tower of London. It's right in that same part of the city.
Instead, the murders came to an abrupt end and left behind one of the greatest mysteries in the annals of crime.
Really cool animation there. They've even got the signature from the original Jack the Ripper letter.
In the East End of London, there's a district known as Whitechapel. In the late 19th century, Whitechapel was known for its overcrowded slums, where many of the capital's poor and unemployed had taken refuge. Day and night, an army of policemen would constantly patrol this labyrinthine network of dim-lit streets, courts, and alleys. One such place was a narrow passage known as George Yard. Near the north entrance of this passage was a residential complex known as George Yard Buildings. It was the morning of August the 7th, 1888, when an upstairs tenant named John Reeves headed out for work.
This is so
Upon
well
reaching
done.
the first floor landing, Reeves encountered the body of a woman lying upon her back in a pool of blood.
Martha Tabram.
Horrified by the sight, he stumbled down to the street below in search for help.
Now, this first victim, here's the thing you have to understand about Whitechapel. Before the Jack the Ripper murders and after the Jack the Ripper murders, there were murders happening in Whitechapel. This was not, unfortunately, an uncommon thing. And so, while they have what are called the 5 canonical victims of Jack the Ripper, there's some question about whether or not there were some before, some after. Certainly some before. I don't think there's any question that nothing can really be definitively attributed to him after Mary Jane Kelly, because the escalation, kind of stops. But it's certainly possible there were ones before. Martha Tabram is the one that a lot of people look to as being the first one.
Constable Thomas Barrett was the first officer on the scene. He was soon joined by Dr. Timothy Killeen, who conducted a brief examination. The woman had been stabbed 39 times, primarily in the chest and abdomen. Dr. Killeen estimated that she had been dead for, quote, about 3 hours, thus placing the time of death at approximately 2:30 in the morning.
And it's hard for me to believe in a busy place like this in Whitechapel, where there's people out in all hours of the night, that she lay there for 3 hours. As you'll see later with the other victims, none of them were there longer than maybe 15 minutes before they were found, sometimes a matter of minutes before they were found. But 3 hours in a busy place like this, that seems really strange to me.
The woman had likely been attacked where she was found, as no blood was found beyond the staircase landing. But this was strange, as none of the tenants in this crowded building had heard a single cry for help or a disturbance of any kind.
I really feel like she had to have been moved.
One exception was Amy Hewitt, a tenant who claimed to have heard a lone cry of murder. But this was early in the evening of August the 6th, and the scream had emanated from outside the complex. Hewitt further explained, "The district round here is rather rough, and cries of murder are a frequent, if not nightly, occurrence."
Can you imagine living in a place where pretty much every night you hear somebody cry, "Murder!" I mean, come on. But this will happen again with Mary Jane Kelly. People hear the cry of murder right around the time that she's killed. So, yeah, imagine living in a place where that's a common occurrence like that.
The victim was eventually identified as 39-year-old Martha Tabram. Tabram was a mother of 2 and had separated from her husband many years prior.
Now you're going to notice some common themes here with a lot of these victims, whether or not Martha Tabram is one of the Jack the Ripper victims. They're all in their 30s and 40s, most of them working as prostitutes. There's some question about one of them. A lot of them have families, have ex-husbands, have children, but have fallen on hard times and have resorted to prostitution. A lot of them are also alcoholics, and that's part of the reason why they end up on their own. And just a point of clarification, if you ever see this where it says Nay like that, that just means maiden name. So her maiden name was White.
Her last known address was 19 George Street, a common lodging house less than 300 meters from the site of her death. Tabram had made a living through prostitution, and one of her associates was a woman named Mary Ann Connolly. Connolly testified that on the evening of August the 6th, she and Tabram had been out drinking with 2 soldiers. Then, shortly before midnight, the party of 4 had separated. Connolly took her client into Angel Alley, while Tabram guided hers into neighboring George Yard. It was the last time she saw Tabram alive.
A lot of times these prostitutes couldn't even afford a place to stay, and there were a lot of places in Whitechapel where you could pay, I think it was called DOS money. It was basically a nightly rent. You could pay by the night for lodging. And a lot of these were common lodging houses where you had multiple people. And so a lot of times these prostitutes were going out at 1 or 2 in the morning trying to find a couple of Johns so they could earn their money so they could have a place to sleep for the night. And then the next day they'd do it again. They were just kind of living literally day to day. And so they didn't even often have a place to go to do their thing, So they'd do it in the middle of in a dark alley somewhere. And a lot of times, because they were concerned about pregnancy and things like that, they had really kind of, this is a little graphic, I apologize, but they perfected the ability to not actually allow penetration while making the guy feel like that's what he was doing, kind of a thing. Just kind of one of the quirks of a lot of what was happening with prostitution at the time.
Barely 2 hours later, Constable Barrett had spoken to a soldier loitering near the north entrance of George Yard. The soldier had told Barrett that he was, quote, waiting for his mate who had gone away with a girl.
And Edmund Reed is the character that Matthew McFadden plays in Ripper Street. He was involved somewhat in the Jack the Ripper murders. He was a detective inspector in Whitechapel.
Half an hour later, Tabram is presumed to have died. Both Connolly and Barrett were called upon to identify the soldiers, but all those accused could provide an alibi. One had been at home with his wife, another at an army base, and yet another in a completely different part of the city. This was enough for Inspector Edmund Reed, the lead investigator on the case, to abandon this line of inquiry. Connolly and Barrett, having both picked out the wrong men, they could not be trusted again, as their evidence would be worthless.
And then you got nobody, really.
Even if a soldier had been responsible, no one could deduce a motive. The people of Whitechapel might have been accustomed to crime and violence, but the sheer brutality of this attack was as frightening as it was confounding.
And he hasn't really described much of the wounds beyond the 39 stab wounds, but there were other things that were done to her sexually that were pretty horrible and pretty abusive. She was treated quite shamefully, if you want to look into the details of it.
The crime is one of the most brutal that have occurred for some years. For a poor, defenseless woman to be outraged and stabbed in such a manner is almost beyond belief. These were the concluding remarks delivered at the final inquest held on August the 23rd. Only a week later, things would go from bad to worse.
So another thing we should talk about all this is they would do these inquests, and they would actually be kind of done publicly. It's very unusual. Like, for an American audience, we can't really understand how they did things. I don't even know if they do it that way still, but they would actually gather everyone kind of like in a room, almost like a courtroom setting, and they would present the findings to everyone. And there would be an opportunity for discussion and questions and things like that. And so when they talk about these inquests, that's what they are. They're actually almost like I wouldn't really say a trial, but almost like a press conference, but not really for the press, you know? It's hard to explain, but if you could just imagine a room full of people gathering to hear the presentation of the findings.
On the morning of August the 31st, a man named Robert Paul left his home on Foster Street and headed for work. After making a right turn into Bucks Row, he spotted a man standing in the road. The man turned around to face him and said, "Come and look over here. There's a woman lying on the pavement." The stranger was named Charles Cross, and he too had been on his way to work when he first caught sight of the woman. The two men now cautiously approached. The woman's hands were cold to the touch, and Cross believed she was dead.
Now, it says body found, but there's some speculation that she was actually still faintly alive when she was first found.
Paul, however, thought he could sense faint breathing. But instead of seeking immediate help, Cross and Paul were more concerned about being late for work. As such, they quickly resumed their morning commute, hoping to notify policemen along the way.
Now, that seems really callous, doesn't it? We found a woman lying there, and nobody at first knew the extent of her injuries. It was only much later they found out how badly she'd been mutilated. But you have to understand the time and place in which they live, and that's important for any time we're studying history. You've got to put yourself in the mindset of the people who were there and what they would have been thinking and what they were experiencing. This is a place where it was not uncommon to find women lying on the side of the road like this. This is a place where violence was very regular. This is a place where very poor people are scraping together a living. And when you have a job and you've got to get to it, and there's a lot of other people who might like to have your job, and you might lose it if you show up even 5 minutes late, all of that's going on in this. And these guys, they find her, but they try to find police, and they find somebody pretty quickly. So,
fortunately, Constable John Neal was just around the corner. Neal was equipped with a lantern and found the woman lying on her back with a deep cut across the throat. The wound was still bleeding and parts of her body were still warm. He was soon joined by Constable John Thane, who was sent at once to fetch a nearby doctor. Upon his arrival, shortly after 4 o'clock, Dr. Reese Llewellyn estimated that, quote, she had not been dead more than half an hour. In other words, Cross and Paul had likely found the woman mere minutes after she was killed. Furthermore, 3 officers had patrolled the vicinity just a few minutes prior. Constable Neal had last inspected Bucks Row at approximately 3:15. So too had Sergeant Henry Kirby, whereas Constable Thane had merely passed the end of the street.
And this is going to become an important theme with all of these murders, and that's why we know so closely the time that these women were murdered and how quickly this must have happened, which is one of the really strange things about it. Because you have all of these police constables that have these routes that they walk regularly, they know almost to the minute when they were at different places, if they were actually on their route as they should be. And though it's really dark and you don't have streetlights everywhere, very few places in the city of London, and these are actually going to take place in Whitechapel, which is, it's semantics, but only one of the murders actually takes place within the city limits of London. The others are in like suburbs or, of other areas like Whitechapel. And so, there's very few places that don't have regular police coverage during all of this.
None of whom had seen nor heard anything amiss. Upon the body's removal to the mortuary, a shocking discovery was made. Apart from 2 incisions in the throat, the woman had also been, quote, disemboweled. No organs had been removed, but Dr. Llewellyn found, quote, several incisions running across the abdomen. He also believed that the killer possessed, quote, some rough anatomical knowledge, for he seemed to have attacked all the vital parts.
And this is one of the ongoing disagreements that different people will have about these murders, is how much anatomical knowledge did the killer have. Some people say, it didn't take any knowledge at all. Others will argue he had to have some knowledge because he seemed like he knew his way around. And then when you add the factor of how little time he had to do these disembowelings, and sometimes he takes organs, you have to wonder if he didn't at least know something. And that leads people to say he was a doctor, or he was at least a butcher of some kind, things like that. A butcher like pigs, for example. Pigs' anatomy is very similar to human anatomy, so you could see how that could possibly help someone. It is fascinating, though, that in this case, they didn't know she had been disemboweled until they got her back to the examination. They didn't know at the site.
The victim was quickly identified. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols, and she had turned 43 just 5 days before the murder.
And so you see, once again, we're talking late 30s, early 40s, ex-husband, 6 children. I think alcoholism is involved here. She, her youngest kid was 8 at this point, or was 10 at this point. She's got kids who live in the 1960s. Imagine that. In the 1960s, we had children of a Jack the Ripper murder victim that still lived. And I'm curious to know if any of them were ever interviewed or any talked publicly about this stuff. That'd be kind of fascinating to know.
Nichols had at least 6 children, and her last known address was a common lodging house at 56 Flower and Dean Street. On the night of her death, Nichols had been turned away from a lodging house on Thrall Street as she lacked the funds to pay for a bed. Seeking to raise the money through prostitution, Nichols had then ventured down Osborne Street before meeting her friend, Ellen Holland. The two of them shared a brief exchange, but Nichols was visibly drunk. When they parted ways around 2:30, Holland saw Nichols staggering eastward along Whitechapel Road.
So, one of the things that becomes a theme here with these victims is the alcoholism, which makes them a little easier target, because they probably got liquored up before they went out turning tricks. They all seem, except for Mary Jane Kelly, the last victim, they're all a little older, which was pretty common for the prostitutes in Whitechapel. They all are also pretty desperate for money. And I think in most cases he strangles them first, which is why you don't have people screaming. You also, if he strangled them to death and killed them before he cut them, that explains why there's no arterial spray, which means the killer can walk away without having blood all over him. These are all things that kind of play into this investigation.
Barely an hour later, she was found dead. Apart from the body itself, the killer had left nothing in their wake. No blood trail, no murder weapon, no witnesses. Inspector Joseph Helson, the lead investigator on the case, stated that, quote, "Not an atom of evidence can be obtained to connect any person with the crime." While the Nichols case ground to a screeching halt, its similarities with the Martha Tabram case had not gone unnoticed. In both cases, the attack had been needlessly ferocious, and there was no discernible motive. Both victims were prostitutes of roughly the same age and moved in the same circles. The only meaningful difference was their injuries. Tabram had been repeatedly stabbed, whereas Nichols had suffered multiple slash wounds.
There's a lot of disagreement on whether or not they were connected. You can make the argument, if you understand how serial killers work, that there's an escalation, there's an experimenting, so to speak. A lot of times, serial killers, the investigators will end up finding out that there were previous victims that they didn't know about because they don't fit an MO that eventually develops, because serial killers kind of eventually develop their style, so to speak. And so the early killings are sometimes different than the later ones because they're figuring out what works and what doesn't. They're escalating to a degree. So I can see both sides of the argument about Martha Tabram. The only thing that makes me wonder is, 39 stab wounds and some other abuses, and then going to slitting the throat and disemboweling doesn't seem like a connected escalation. I would expect maybe a couple of stab wounds and then that, but what happened the first time seems much more personal. So my personal feeling is that they are not connected, but I can accept the possibility that they are.
Differences aside, the prevailing assumption was that the same deranged individual had committed both murders. A conviction that would only grow stronger in the days that followed.
Love the way he presents this. It's really well done. Annie Chapman.
As the sun was rising on September the 8th, a man named John Richardson was on his way to work. At 4:45, he made a quick stop at 29 Hanbury Street. He went through the entrance and out the back door by way of a cramped hallway. Richardson then sat down on the backyard steps before grabbing a knife to trim a vexing piece of leather from his boot. Once satisfied, he left the building and shut the front door behind him. About an hour later, a third-floor tenant of the same address, John Davis, plodded downstairs and into the hallway. The front door was now wide open, but the one in the back was closed. When Davis went to open it, he found the bloodied remains of a woman lying on her back just below the steps. Inspector Joseph Chandler was the first officer on the scene. After a brief inspection, he sent at once for a medic. Dr. George Phillips arrived at 6:30 and found the woman, quote, terribly mutilated. The throat had been, quote, dissevered deeply, whereas the abdomen had been, quote, entirely laid open.
So unlike with Polly Nichols, you have a very clear sense that she has been disemboweled. The organs are like tossed around, so you can see the clear connection between Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman, but also the escalation. And part of that may be having more time, being in a more secluded area, being in a fenced-in backyard, as opposed to being out on the main street. So you're not going to have policemen patrolling this area, so there's a little more time.
Intestines had been, quote, lifted out of the body and placed by the shoulder of the corpse. The body was then conveyed to the mortuary, while Inspector Chandler and Dr. Phillips conducted a sweep of the backyard.
This leather apron is going to be key because that's going to lead to Anytime you have things like this where it gets sensationalized in the press, you can see that even today when the news talks about something all the time, it builds up the tension, it builds up the excitement level. I don't mean excitement as in happy, but like excited, like as in the energy level goes up. And you start to get all the sensationalization of things. And this leather apron is going to become one of those things that starts causing people to speculate and fantasize about who they think it is and stuff like that. But there's a lot of things too that this is your first sense that there's some ritualistic component to this because of how things are laid out around the body, and this won't be the last time that happens.
Most of what they found belonged to the tenants of the building, but just below the resting place of the woman's feet, they found a small piece of cloth and 2 combs. The items had likely belonged to the victim, but it seemed to Dr. Phillips that they had been deliberately positioned and arranged by the killer. The post-mortem revealed that 2 brass rings had been forcefully removed from the victim's left hand. These rings were nowhere to be found. Portions of the victim's abdomen had also gone missing, including the womb. Dr. Phillips believed that, quote, the mode in which these portions were extracted showed some anatomical knowledge.
Now keep in mind that says some. That doesn't mean you're a doctor or trained. It just means some anatomical knowledge. A butcher would have this. Other people of other backgrounds could have this kind of knowledge as well.
This point was greatly expanded upon at a subsequent inquest. The injuries had been made by someone who had considerable anatomical skill.
This one says considerable.
There were no meaningless cuts. For instance, no mere slaughterer of animals could have carried out these operations. It must have been someone accustomed to the post-mortem room.
So you can see how there's disagreement about that, and how a statement like that will lead people to start saying it had to have been a doctor, it had to have been somebody with medical training. Other people disagree with that.
The victim was quickly identified as Annie Chapman. Chapman's date of birth is a bit uncertain, but she was roughly 47 at the time of her death.
Once again, formerly married, lots of children. Her youngest child here is only 8 years old. Again, you've got a very, very similar situation. But notice with her that you've got a 12-year-old daughter who has died. You have a newborn daughter who died. You have a 1-year-old son who died, a newborn daughter who died here. Another one. So of these 7 children that she had, only 2 are living by this point. And so you can see the pain that might have been involved in that. So very, very similar to Polly Nichols and Martha Tabram in terms of background.
She had at least 7 children, but was tragically only survived by 2. Her last known address was a common lodging house at 35 Dorset Street.
Another common lodging house.
On the night of her death, Chapman had been denied accommodations as she lacked the funds to pay for
Didn't have the
that.
DOS money again.
She was escorted off the premises by the night watchman, who then saw her vanish into a nearby alleyway.
So many parallels.
What happened to Chapman over the next few hours, nobody knows. Her whereabouts during this time is a complete mystery. But unlike the 2 previous cases, a witness in the Chapman case might have caught a glimpse of the killer. At 5:30 on the morning of September the 8th, a woman named Elizabeth Long spotted a man and a woman conversing outside 29 Hanbury Street. Long was positive that the woman she'd seen was Annie Chapman, but the man had stood with his back towards Long, so she never saw his face. Long did, however, manage to overhear a fragment of their conversation. The man had posed the question, "Will you?" To which the woman responded, "Yes."
You have to say, the lack of catching the killer is not because they didn't do a thorough investigation. We've got a ton of documentation. There were many, many witnesses that were questioned. Their detailed records of the body and things like that. Now, there are some things that are going to come down the road in the 3rd and 4th murders that were botched beyond belief when it comes to the police. In particular, some handwriting that may have been belonged to the killer. But at least at this point, they've done a really good job of doing the detective work on the ground for 1888.
Now, a lasting point of contention in the Chapman case is the time of death. According to Dr. Phillips, when he arrived at 6:30, Chapman had been dead for, quote, at least 2 hours. That would place her death at around 4:30.
Which is impossible.
but according to Long, she saw Chapman alive a full hour later. Then there's the testimony of John Richardson. Richardson was the son of one of the tenants in the building. At 4:45, he made a routine checkup on the door to the basement, which had previously suffered a break-in. When he found it secure, he sat down on the backyard steps to trim a piece of leather from his boot. Even though he sat mere centimeters from the murder site, Richardson did not see a body.
And he would have. And I think there's also someone who's in the next yard over who hears like a thud up against the wall, which was probably the killer attacking her, which comes later.
He was adamant on this point. I could not have failed to notice the deceased if she had been there. To muddle the timeline even further, there's the testimony of Albert Kadosh.
Here we go.
About 20 minutes past 5, Kadosh had gone through the backyard of 27 Hanbury Street when he heard voices coming from nearby. They were barely audible, however, and Kadosh had only made out the word no. A few minutes later, he heard something falling against the wooden fence dividing the 2 yards. There's no one way to untangle this web of contradictions, but Dr. Phillips did concede the possibility that he'd miscalculated. That, quote, the coldness of the morning and the great loss of blood had skewed his opinion, which was...
Yeah, the stuff, the medical science stuff, especially in 1888, it's all very, like, up in the air, and it's an estimate, so you have to go with the eyewitnesses here. You've got to assume that 5:30, people are going to remember things. Eyewitnesses are very unreliable. In fact, if they're very detailed, usually it's because they're wrong or they're deliberately lying. So you have to kind of go with the preponderance of evidence. I think it's fair to say that 5:30-ish is probably when she is killed. She's witnessed probably minutes before she's killed when she's talking to the killer. And you got to assume that the eyewitness saw the actual killer. You got to assume that the guy who heard this around 5:20, it's probably right in that area.
Was largely based on the warmth of the body. So, presuming that Dr. Phillips did miscalculate and the recollections of Long and Kadosh were off by a few minutes, that would place Chapman's death at around 5:30 in the morning. By this point, the dim light of dawn would have provided the tenants of 29 Hanbury Street an unobstructed view of the murder site, some of whom had even slept with their windows open. In spite of this, the killer managed to evade detection and even made time to arrange the victim's possessions.
And he had that privacy to be able to do that, unlike out on the street where there would have been police patrols. It does make me wonder how they ended up there. She obviously had to have gone with him willingly to that backyard. Maybe they just thought it was a place they could go, where there'd be a little bit of privacy to be able to do their thing and then be done. But it seems strange they would go to the backyard of a private building like that.
As the tally of victims gradually mounted, the public grew increasingly anxious. They were not only frightened by the murders, but frustrated with the police and their perceived incompetence. Even across the pond were the efforts of the police fiercely criticized. The London police and detective force is probably the stupidest in the world.
I think they actually did a fairly good job under the circumstances.
And illustrations failed to capture were the overwhelming odds stacked in favor of the perpetrator. The police were up against someone who seemingly struck without motive, someone who left no murder weapon, and few witnesses. On top of that, the East End was severely overcrowded, while the police were understaffed. As one newspaper put it, "A man in the East End of London is a grain of sand, as invisible and almost as much beyond identification amid the masses." At no point would this become more apparent than during the events of September the 30th.
The double event. All right, we're going to stop right there. We'll get into the double event, as it's known, next time. We'll come back tomorrow with that next episode. We've gotten through a few of the chapters so far. Looks like we've got a good start to all of this. My plans when I do get to London, hopefully sometime in 2022, not only going to visit the graves, the remaining known graves of the victims, but also we're going to take a Jack the Ripper tour and tour the sites, although several of the murder sites look nothing like they did in 1888, but it'll still be fun to do that, and I will definitely record all of that for you guys. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Definitely check out Lemmino, one of the best YouTube channels out there if you're into history. We'll see you again tomorrow with the next episode. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of my reaction to Lemmino and Jack the Ripper. And thanks so much for all the great feedback and the input and the response to part 1. I know a lot of you were looking forward to this. I've been looking forward to it. It's a topic that I've always been fascinated by. So we're going to go ahead and dive right into part 2. Just a couple of things as we dive into this. This is the point in the story where we start to get a lot more evidence, but also a lot more questions about what is from the killer and what is not. So, for example, we're going to go into the night that is called the double event, where there were 2 murders. And both murders are traditionally attributed to Jack the Ripper, but there is some question about one of them and whether or not it really was him. So that's one thing. Another thing is, this is where we're going to start to get the letters. This is where the name Jack the Ripper is going to become attributed to the killer. And you're going to have all these letters, and there's a lot of debate about whether or not any of them actually came from the killer, or if every single one of them is in fact a fabrication. We know some of them are, for sure. But there's at least 1 or 2 that a lot of people think might actually be from the killer. And then, of course, we have probably the biggest controversy of all, at least in my mind, which is the erasing of some writing that probably did come from the killer. So we'll get into all of that. Let's go ahead and dive in.
On September the 29th, a routine Saturday meeting was held at the Socialist Club on Berners Street. When the meeting came to a close around midnight, all but a few members returned home. Those who remained proceeded to drink and socialize. Half an hour in September the 30th, Joseph Lave stepped outside to get some fresh air.
So I should point out before we get any further that you'll notice that all of the 5 canonical victims of Jack the Ripper, the ones that most people attribute to him, take place on the weekend, Friday, Saturday.
Lave used the side entrance leading into Dutville's yard and lingered for about 10 minutes. Moments after Lave got back inside, Morris Eagle accessed the building via the same entrance. He too was a member of the club and had just returned after escorting a woman home. Neither of them noticed anything unusual. 20 minutes later, the sound of a horse and carriage could be heard trotting down Berners Street. The driver was Louis Diemschutz, the steward of the clubhouse.
And you'll notice too that these are all primarily Jewish immigrants. So this is a section of town where you've got a lot of Jews frequenting, and this is going to come into play a little bit later.
When Diemschutz drove into Dutville's yard, his pony abruptly veered to the left. When he looked down to his right, he thought he could discern something in the darkness. Diemschutz stepped down from his barrow, and after lighting a match, could see a woman lying on her side against the wall. Without even knowing if she was, quote, drunk or dead, Diemschutz rushed inside the club to check on his wife. When he found her safe and sound, he alerted the other members, and a small crowd soon gathered outside. They could now see that the woman's throat had been, quote, fearfully cut, and that, quote, a stream of blood was trickling down the yard.
So you notice with this one too that the time of night is much earlier. The Annie Chapman and Polly Nichols murders take place right just before dawn, much later in the night, like 4:30, 5 o'clock, that time period. This is much, much earlier than that.
Eagle, Diemschutz, and a few others promptly dispersed to find a policeman. While a growing crowd of bystanders waited for authorities to arrive, there was no sign of the perpetrator. But across the city, less than a kilometer to the west, an even more ghoulish discovery was about to be made. At 1:30 of the same morning, Constable Edward Watkins patrolled an open space known as Mitre Square. Watkins' beat would take him through the square about once every 13 minutes, and on this occasion it was deserted. But in the time it took Watkins to complete another rotation, Mitre Square was turned into a crime scene. I next came in at 1:44. I turned to the right. I saw the body of a woman lying there on her back. I saw her throat was cut and her bowels protruding. The stomach was ripped up. She was lying in a pool of blood. Dr. George Siqueira and Dr. Frederick Brown soon converged upon the scene. They found terrible injuries inflicted upon the woman's face, throat, and abdomen. The intestines had been, quote, drawn out to a large extent and placed over the right shoulder.
So this one by far is the worst, most gruesome one so far, and he probably had a little more time. Some of the other murders, there's maybe a 5 to 10 minute window where nobody's there where this could have been done. As far as we know, the Mitre Square murder, there's much more time available, possibly as much as a half hour. So a lot of time available. I believe this is also the only murder that actually takes place within the actual city limits of the city of London itself. So different.
Among the many less...
That means it's a different jurisdiction as far as the investigation goes.
Observations to the face, Dr. Brown noted that, quote, the lobe and auricle of the right ear was cut obliquely through. Based on their expert opinions, coupled with the testimony of Watkins, the woman had died within minutes of her body being found. Back in Berners Street, Dr. Frederick Blackwell and Dr. George Phillips had reached the same conclusion. The woman in Dutville's yard had died within minutes of her body being found. But unlike previous victims, she had only suffered injuries to the throat. There were no abdominal mutilations or anything else by which to connect the attack to the others.
So that leaves you with two possibilities. Number one, it's a different killer, which a lot of people will argue that is the case. And I'm not entirely convinced of that, but I'm open to that possibility. The second thing, which is what happens here for sure, we know, is that the killer's interrupted. He doesn't get to finish what he's doing, which also would explain why then he goes and finds another victim the same night. So both are very plausible scenarios.
But the murder in Dutville's yard and the one in Mitre Square were separated by less than 1 kilometer and some 45 minutes. This allowed for a chilling possibility. It was suspected then, as it continues to be today, that when Diemschutz came clattering through the gateway, he unwittingly interrupted the murder. The killer may even have become trapped inside Dutville's yard because the gate on Berners Street was the only point of entry. Perhaps they saw an opportunity to escape when Diemschutz then rushed inside the club. From there, it would have taken them less than 15 minutes to reach Mitre Square. Plenty of time to hunt for another victim.
Yep.
But it must be emphasized that this is pure speculation. There is no evidence to suggest the two murders were even connected.
That's true.
The woman in Dutville's yard was identified as 44-year-old Elizabeth Stride. Stride was a Swedish immigrant who'd lived in London for over 2 decades.
I want to take a moment here, and I should have addressed this yesterday, but I didn't. When talking about Jack the Ripper, it's very easy to get caught up in talking about these victims as what they were, which is victims. And to forget that these are women who, they weren't just victims. You know, we tend to think of their lives as only what happened to them that night. But these are women who had 30, 40 years of life in most cases, except for Mary Kelly, who had ex-husbands, they had children in most cases, who had family. And who had a very compelling story of their own in many cases, who at a time in history when there were certain things expected of women, and when women made the choices that some of these women made, like with alcoholism and with prostitution, they were looked down on a certain way, and nobody really had much sympathy for them. And I think it's important for us to recognize that these were human beings who had value and worth, and who had all of that taken away, and who are now only remembered because of how they were killed and because of the direction their lives went, and not for all the things they had been through. So there's actually a book about that someone recommended to me yesterday. I think I'm going to give that a read. And I believe most, if not all of these women, there are photos of them from earlier in their lives when they were respectable women who had families. And it's worth looking at those because, for a long time, all I ever saw was the crime scene photos because they have photos of the bodies of all 5 of these women. And, it's just very degrading to see them that way. They're naked, they're cut up, not only from the wounds, but from the autopsy. And I think it's much better to remember them as they were once rather than how they ended up.
Following the death of her husband, she had made a living through prostitution. Her last known address was a common lodging house at 32 Flower and Dean Street.
And I'll add this to that. It's easy to judge these women for going into prostitution, but in Victorian England at this time, there weren't a lot of other options. I'm not justifying what they did, but a lot of women went into prostitution because they just felt like there was no other option. It's not because they wanted to. A lot of times it was because of their alcoholism and, which wasn't fully understood or viewed the same way that it is today.
On the night of her death, Stride had been seen by quite an abundance of witnesses. First, she was seen in the company of a, quote, respectably dressed man around 11 o'clock. About 1:45, Stride was seen talking to a man who was, quote, decently dressed and had the appearance of a clerk. Then, only a few minutes before the murder, Stride was seen in the company of a man by Constable William Smith. The man was carrying a small parcel wrapped in newspaper and was of, quote, respectable appearance. It's unclear whether these descriptions are of the same person or if Stride accosted multiple clients as the night progressed. There were other witnesses, some less credible than others, but the one that really stood out from the rest was Israel Schwartz. About 1:45, Schwartz had been walking down Burner Street. As he came up on Dutville's yard, he witnessed a man throwing a woman to the ground in front of the entrance. The woman had, quote, screamed 3 times, but not very loudly. Schwartz would later identify this woman as Elizabeth Stride. Schwartz did not try to intervene, but opted instead to simply cross the street. That's when he spied a second man on the opposite side who was lighting a pipe. The man who attacked the woman then appeared to address the second man by shouting the name Lipsky.
But he might not have been yelling at the second man. He may have been yelling at Israel Schwartz.
The pipe smoker then proceeded to follow Schwartz before eventually breaking away. When taken...
That right there leads to a lot of theories that there were 2 people involved. In fact, if you've ever seen the movie with Johnny Depp, From Hell, that's the theory they proposed there, along with, we'll get into some of the victim or the possible killer theories at the end, but the idea that there was an accomplice that was helping out.
At face value, this story appears to suggest that the killer had an accomplice.
No,
an
I
accomplice
disagree.
by the name of Lipsky. This was indeed the interpretation of some government officials. But Inspector Frederick Abeline, one of the lead investigators on the case, had a very different interpretation. You see, the name Lipsky had gained notoriety in 1887 when a Jewish man by the name of Israel Lipsky was convicted of murder. Owing to the publicity of that case, the surname Lipsky had become an anti-Semitic slur. Abeline therefore deduced that the man who shouted Lipsky was directing an insult at Schwartz, who was described as having a, quote, strong Jewish appearance. The man with the pipe, meanwhile, may have been an innocent passerby who became frightened along with Schwartz.
And ran along with Schwartz.
Whether
That's what
Abeline's interpretation is correct, it's doubtful we'll ever truly know. Nevertheless, Schwartz's account is compelling, as he conceivably witnessed the moment when Elizabeth Stride was attacked. Back in Mitre Square, a large crowd of spectators had assembled upon the scene, all driven by their morbid curiosity to get a glimpse of the body. The post-mortem revealed that the killer had extracted a few organs, including the womb and left kidney.
That kidney's going to come back to be really, really important with some later evidence.
According to Dr. Brown, this extraction required, quote, a good deal of knowledge, which he likened to that of a butcher. By contrast, Dr. Cicada did not find any signs of, quote, great anatomical skill. The woman in Mitre Square was identified as 46-year-old Catherine Eddowes. Eddowes had at least 5 children, but after escaping her abusive husband, she had become estranged from her family.
So there you go. Once again, you have a woman who's got an ex-husband, multiple children. I mean, same MO, 46 years old, right in that same. All 4 of these women have very similar stories. Although I want to say Catherine Eddowes is the only one that there's some question about whether or not she was actually a prostitute. Elizabeth Stride, who was also killed that night, no doubt. In fact, she had the longest history of prostitution of any of them. She had a history of prostitution arrests that goes back more than 20 years. But I think Catherine Eddowes, there's a little doubt about that.
Her last known address was a common lodging house at 55 Flower and Dean Street. On the night of her death, Eddowes had been out drinking. She got so drunk that around 8:30, she was found lying on the sidewalk in Aldgate High Street, surrounded by a crowd. The commotion attracted a few officers, who then escorted Eddowes to a nearby police station. There, she remained locked in a cell until 1 o'clock in the morning.
Think about this. Think about if you're one of those police officers. They're like, we just had this woman in jail, and less than an hour after they let her out, after she's sobered up a little bit, she's dead and horribly mutilated. Oh, that must have been hard for those guys.
After being released from jail, Eddowes was likely spotted in the company of a man in the vicinity of Mitre Square. Only one of the 3 witnesses, Joseph Lavender, had paid close attention to the couple. The man had the appearance of a sailor and wore a, quote, reddish handkerchief round his neck. While Lavender did identify the woman as Catherine Eddowes, he never saw her face. Nevertheless, this sighting was only made some 10 minutes before Eddowes' body was discovered by Constable Watkins.
See, I've got questions about whether or not that's actually Catherine Eddowes. He never saw her face. It could very easily have been somebody else. He just happened to spot a woman and a man near the vicinity. I think she's probably killed a little sooner than this, and that's why there's a little more time to mutilate the body, because the body's found 9 minutes later, and I just don't know that that's enough time for them to have gotten down into Mitre Square for him to strangle and kill her, mutilate her, and get out of there.
What's so incredibly tragic about the Eddowes case is how narrowly the killer escaped justice. First of all, the only private residence in Mitre Square was occupied by a policeman and his family. They had slept right next to an upper floor window overlooking the murder site. Second of all, a night watchman and retired policeman had been cleaning a warehouse within earshot of the murder site. He would routinely hear the footsteps of patrolling officers, yet heard nothing at the time of the murder.
Crazy.
Finally, Constable James Harvey had glanced into Mitre Square at roughly 20 minutes to 2. That's right in between the sighting by Lavender and the body's discovery. Harvey should have...
But again, I just don't think what Lavender saw was the killer. I don't.
...had an unobstructed view of the murder site, yet he failed to notice anything suspicious. Was it too dark? Was the killer standing just a few meters away, cloaked in shadow? Did one or more witnesses get the time wrong? While the killer did ultimately escape, they did not do so without leaving a trace. Shortly before 3 o'clock, a blood-stained piece of cloth was found near the entrance to a building a few blocks to the northeast. It proved to be a ripped portion of the apron worn by Eddowes.
And this is super important evidence right here, as is the next thing they're going to find. Because this tells you the direction the killer is going from the murder scene. Now you have... Boy, this is such an incredibly key piece of evidence. And just moments later, they find what's frustratingly maybe something that could have helped them catch the killer.
The patch had evidently been torn off and then discarded by the killer upon their escape. Now, on the wall above this patch of apron, someone had written a message. "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." To this day, both the meaning and the author of this message remain in doubt. Was it written by the killer? Was it an attempt to cast suspicion upon or even away from the Jewish community? Was it completely unrelated to the murder?
So you've got a couple things here that are key. Number one is the wording, which there's actually a little bit of debate about how it was worded, but this is the generally accepted wording of it. It's the way that it's written, the wording that's used, the spelling of Jews here, and of course then the handwriting. And darn it if they didn't just erase it without even taking a picture of it. That said, the fact that that apron got left there and then the words are written almost makes it seem like the killer was trying to throw them off by leaving it there and kind of misdirection. I don't know. But man, if they had just taken a photograph of the handwriting, it would have come in so handy, especially when they start getting the letters soon after.
Similar questions would soon be raised by a few letters. Letters which had supposedly been written and posted by the killer. Three days before the murder of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, the Central News Agency of London received a letter in the post, the author of which claimed responsibility for the recent murders and to be planning for the, quote, next job. Then, in the aftermath of the two killings, the same agency received a blood-smeared postcard. It contained details about the atrocities, which the author described as a, quote, double event. On the off chance that the letters were genuine, the police decided to make them public. The hope was that someone would recognize the handwriting. Unfortunately, no one ever did. Instead, it merely served to advertise the name with which the letters had been signed.
And this is a big part of why this legend has become so ingrained in our collective memories as this horrifying thing. I don't want to say he only killed 5 women, because that it kind of like limits the fact that 5 women were brutally murdered, and maybe more. And we shouldn't understate that. But in the grand scheme of serial killers, it's not that many compared to what we've seen, especially in the 20th century. But it's the name, the fact they never caught him, it's that it happened in Victorian England. There's all of this stuff that kind of causes it to be mythologized.
Opinions on the letter's authenticity were divided back then and continue to be today. Most notably, the Dear Boss letter had promised to, quote, clip the lady's ears off and send them to the police. The police never received such a package, and neither of the 2 victims had their ears removed. But you may recall that the right earlobe of Eddowes had been, quote, cut obliquely through. Was this a botched attempt by the killer to keep their promise? Or was it merely one of numerous lacerations with no connection to the letter? The contents of the letters notwithstanding, modern linguistic analysis does suggest that they were penned by the same hand. So, hoaxes or not, the authors were likely one and the same. However, the handwriting bore, quote, no resemblance at all to the message written above the torn patch of apron.
Which would be great for us to be able to look at that ourselves today, wouldn't it?
Now, the publication of the letters inspired an onslaught of copycats. Agencies all over London were soon inundated with correspondence imitating the other 2.
Now, imagine for a second, not that you can really put yourself in the mindset of a serial killer, but very often serial killers are narcissists. They have this God complex. They kind of believe they can't be caught. They can do whatever they want. And that's why a lot of them end up taunting the police and sending letters. And that's how they caught the BTK killer. Was he sent a letter many years after having gotten away with a lot of murders. They end up catching him because they found the metadata, because he sent it in as a floppy disk, and they figured out that he was writing it from a church computer where he ended up being like on the board of this church. And so that ended up being the reason they caught BTK, even after years and years of trying. So if you're the real Jack the Ripper killer, you're going to probably want to get in on this, right? And you're going to send something and try to distinguish yourself from all these people pretending to be you. How dare they pretend to be you and make claims about things that you have done? And so he sends in, I think, a genuine letter. But he doesn't send it to the news. He doesn't send it to the police. He sends it to the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, which is a group of vigilantes, civilians who are trying to help catch the killer because they believe the police aren't getting the job done. But I'm sure he'll talk about that here in a minute.
But at least one of them might have been genuine.
And he doesn't sign it Jack the Ripper. You'll notice that, and that's a key, and one of the reasons why I think this one is genuine.
Not because of the contents of the letter, but rather the contents of a box with which it was delivered. On October the 16th, a man named George Lusk received a small package in the post. Lusk was the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a small group of local tradesmen who sought to identify the killer. The package consisted of a letter and a cardboard box containing half a kidney. The doctors who examined the kidney all agreed that it was human, but whether it was the same left kidney removed from the body of Eddowes could not be determined. It could, for instance, have been an elaborate hoax by a medical student or someone with access to human organs. The author of the accompanying letter, meanwhile, insisted that the kidney did belong to the victim and that they had fried and eaten the other half.
And I don't know whatever happened to this kidney. It was probably destroyed. But boy, if they'd held on to that, and I know we have Catherine Eddowes' body somewhere, although some of these bodies are probably gone by now, but at least it would have been a possibility of comparing DNA today if there was any possible left.
A popular theory at the time, and one that still is today, was that some of the letters had been fabricated by the press. According to Chief Inspector John Littlechild, the letters were, quote, a smart piece of journalistic work. Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson dismissed the letters as, quote, the creation of an enterprising London journalist. Meanwhile, Chief Constable Melville McNaughton thought he could discern the, quote, stained forefinger of the journalist. There are a few candidates for who this journalist might have been, but there is no solid evidence against any one of them. Whether it was a hoax by an enterprising journalist or the genuine prose of the Ripper, the letters did nonetheless receive widespread attention. They commanded space in virtually every newspaper and dominated much of the public discourse throughout October, a month which passed without a single atrocity bearing the signature marks of Jack the Ripper. Perhaps it was finally over. It is pretty certain that the master has become frightened and has suspended his horrible work for the present, if not for good.
If only. This is horrible. Absolutely horrible.
On the morning of November the 9th, a merchant and property owner named John McCarthy was going through his bookkeeping. McCarthy was the landlord of Miller's Court, and the tenants of room 13 had fallen behind on their rent. McCarthy sent at once for his assistant, Thomas Boyer, to collect the money at 11:15. After knocking twice without response, Boyer went around the corner to peer through a window, but his view was obstructed by a coat or curtain, so Boyer had to reach through a broken window pane to pull it aside. That's when he saw the severely mutilated body of a woman lying upon a bed in the corner of the room.
There are crime scene photos of Mary Jane Kelly. If you are not faint of heart and can live with seeing them, they are available online. Absolutely just mind-blowingly horrible. There was nothing left of her to even really recognize her as having been much of a human being. You have to figure he probably had hours. It's the only one that was killed indoors. Goes against the MO in a lot of ways. She's much younger. She's in her 20s. Lot of differences here.
Miller's Court was soon crawling with police, but the door to room 13 was locked and had to be forced open with a pickaxe. What they found inside was truly the stuff of nightmares. The sight we saw, I cannot drive away from my mind. It looked more like the work of a devil than of a man. The whole scene is more than I can describe. I hope I may never see such a sight again. Dr. George Phillips described the body as, quote, cut all to pieces. Dr. Thomas Bond described the woman's face as, quote, hacked beyond recognition. The abdomen had been, quote, emptied of its viscera, while the throat had been, quote, severed all round, down to the bone. The body had been monstrously disfigured, with loose organs dispersed all around it. The room itself was sparsely furnished and offered little in the way of clues. 2 tables, 1 or 2 chairs, and a small cabinet. Amongst the ashes of a fireplace, the police found patches of burned clothing. Had the killer tried to dispose of evidence, or had it merely been used for warmth and light? The victim was identified almost immediately. Her name was Mary Jane Kelly, and she was the tenant of 13 Miller's Court. But nearly everything about Kelly's life is shrouded in mystery.
Yeah, and the photos that are out there that claim to be of Mary Jane Kelly when she was alive, there's still some question about those, but it seems quite possible that she was married to a man named Davies, that she had at least 1 child, maybe a couple of children with him. I tend to believe those accounts, and I've seen some of the census records and things like that that claim to have been her. But yeah, she's the most mysterious by far of all the victims. She's like 25, 26 years old at the time. Very, very interesting that this is the final victim.
She was presumably of Welsh or Irish descent and in her mid-20s, making her the youngest victim by far. But given that no matching records of a Mary Jane Kelly have been found, it's probable that she was using a fake identity. In any case, Kelly had not been living alone. Up until a few days before the murder, she had cohabited with a man named Joseph Barnett. They had only separated on October the 30th because Barnett disapproved of Kelly's prostitution and the people with whom she associated. But they did see each other again. On the evening of November the 8th, Barnett paid Kelly a visit. Upon his arrival, he found Kelly in the company of a woman who was just about to leave. Unfortunately, there are conflicting accounts about who this woman was, when Barnett arrived, and how long he stayed. If we choose to...
And these are some of the reasons why at least some people point to Joseph Barnett as a possible killer, because of the conflicting statements and the doubts and the questions and the seeming lies that he tells. I don't buy it, though.
To believe Barnett, he arrived at some point between 7 and a quarter to 8 and left before 9 o'clock. Shortly before midnight, Kelly was spotted in the company of a man by her neighbor, Mary Ann Cox. When Cox passed the couple, they were about to enter Kelly's room. Cox bid Kelly goodnight, but she was, quote, very much intoxicated and barely able to respond. Once they had gone inside, Cox could hear Kelly singing. When Cox then left the court about an hour later, Kelly could still be heard singing.
I think the song was called something like "A Violet Plucked from My Mother's Grave," or I don't remember the exact words, but people knew what the song was that she was singing. It was a very popular song at the time.
By 2 o'clock, Kelly had apparently ventured back outside, for she was spotted by a man named George Hutchinson. The two of them were supposedly well acquainted, and Kelly had asked if he could spare a few coins.
Another suspect.
But Hutchinson was broke, and Kelly was desperate for money, so they soon parted ways. Moments later, Hutchinson observed Kelly being accosted by a well-dressed man. The two of them had a seemingly jovial interaction and began walking north. Hutchinson found it suspicious that such a well-dressed man would seek the company of a woman like Kelly. As such, when the couple passed him by, he scrutinized the man's appearance. He was, for instance, carrying a pair of gloves in his right hand and a small parcel in his left. Hutchinson decided to shadow the couple as they proceeded to Miller's Court. Before they vanished up the court, the man handed Kelly a red handkerchief, and she had supposedly told him, "All right, my dear, come along. You will be comfortable."
Remember, a red handkerchief was spotted around the neck of one of the suspects on the double event night. That was some of the witnesses saw that. So, there's something there.
Hutchinson remained in the vicinity until 3 o'clock, but neither Kelly nor the man reappeared.
And I should clarify that there's a strong possibility that Hutchinson was trying to, because why is he following them? It all seemed really, really strange. So there's certainly a possibility that he read that account in the press about the red handkerchief and he deliberately mentions that little tidbit to give himself some credibility.
At roughly the same time, Cox returned home. In stark contrast to the loud singing upon her last departure, Cox was now struck by the complete absence of sound and light from Kelly's room. Finally, at approximately 4 o'clock, a tenant above and a woman across from Kelly's room heard cries of murder. The voice was that of a woman, and it appeared to emanate from nearby. Meanwhile, other denizens of the court heard no screams at all.
Again, a pretty common thing that happens in Whitechapel, people yelling murder. Remember that happened way, way back at the beginning of all this.
According to Dr. Bond, Kelly died between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning. Dr. Phillips placed the time of death a few hours later. But some witnesses were quite adamant that they had seen or even spoken to Kelly as late as 8 or 10 o'clock in the morning. Keep in mind that her body was discovered at 11:15. These contradictions are difficult to reconcile, and the precise time of death eludes us to this day.
A lot of questions.
Mary Jane Kelly is typically regarded as the Ripper's final victim. Along with Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, and Catherine Eddowes, she is part of the canonical 5, the 5 victims most likely to have been slain by the same hand.
But of course, you can add Martha Tabram. There was actually another one before that, and there's some after. There's some question about whether or not Elizabeth Stride's one of the victims.
Martha Tabram might have been a victim of Jack the Ripper, but opinions are divided. The same is true of at least a handful of other cases.
Alice Mackenzie is one that I often see as a possibility, but these are much, much later, and I have a hard time believing that he just stopped. Serial killers don't just stop. Something happened after Mary Jane Kelly. He died, or he was arrested, or he was institutionalized, or he moved. He did not stop on his own. There's just no way that happened.
Even the canonical 5 are not without controversy, so the total number of victims is a matter of debate. Presuming that Kelly was indeed the final victim, one has to wonder why. Why did the murders come to such a sudden end? Did the Ripper give in to fears of being caught? Were they imprisoned for a different crime? Perhaps they succumbed to an illness or committed suicide. Could they have migrated to another country? Perhaps they deliberately changed their modus operandi to confuse the police. The possibilities are virtually endless, which means there is no shortage of suspects.
All right, so we're going to wrap it up right there because we're going to spend the next video talking about the suspects. And I will give my opinion on why or why not. I think each of them is a valid suspect, and I'll throw out 1 or 2 of my own that may not have been mentioned. I don't know who all he's going to mention. I guess I could look here at the chapters. Couple of these strong possibilities. There's some others that aren't mentioned there, but let me know your thoughts about what we just talked about today. Use the comment section below, and I will be back tomorrow as we talk about the suspects. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everyone, to our 3rd and final installment reacting to Lemmino's series on, well, it's just one video on Jack the Ripper. We're going to dive into his presentation of some of the most common suspects today. I will offer my own thoughts on the suspects that he presents, which I don't know who they're going to be, and then any that I think are major suspects that should be discussed that are not mentioned in this video, I'll mention myself. So, with that in mind, just a couple of things. Number one, some of you have been commenting on the previous 2 videos that there are spots where the sound kind of gets muffled and sounds a little off, and there's a reason for that. There are copyright issues with some of the music that's being used in this series, and so when I upload the video, it gives me the option. I can either just mute out that entire section all sound, delete the section, or have YouTube kind of go in and muffle the music, but try to keep the rest of it. So if you notice there are spots where that happens, that is why, and I won't know until I upload this video where those spots are. So if that happens, rest assured I'm aware of it. Also, we talked yesterday briefly about the women and how it's important for us to remember that these were human beings who had lives and who had stories, not just victims of a nameless killer. And with that in mind, I found a video that I was watching today that I really enjoyed, and I'm going to put the link in the description to it below. It's by one of the Jack the Ripper tours over in London, and they give a little bit more of the background. They visit each of the grave sites and give a little bit more of the background into the women, as well as things like who attended their funeral, what happened with their funeral, who identified the body, things like that. So a little bit more information I thought was really worth your time. So check it out if you would. The link's in the description. Let's go ahead and dive in, starting with chapter 7.
Following the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, a rumor began to circulate that someone called Leather Apron was in the habit of abusing prostitutes. The name quickly made its way into the press, and soon enough it became synonymous with a killer. In fact, Leather Apron was the predominant pseudonym before Jack the Ripper.
Yep.
But the man identified as Leather Apron was soon cleared of all suspicion. His real name was John Picer, and he was in a different part of London on the night when Nichols was attacked.
Yep, solid alibi.
This misguided manhunt is somewhat emblematic of the whole investigation. The police pursued even the most tenuous of leads due to a lack of evidence and mounting pressure from the public.
So as the tension mounts, as the pressure mounts for them to produce a suspect, you have a much higher degree of likelihood that false leads and bad suspects are going to come about, and especially when you now have multiple police agencies involved, and you have the City of London and then the Metropolitan Police, depending on the jurisdiction, and then you've got on top of that folks like the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. You've got all sorts of stuff, and it's just a recipe for tons of false leads and bad information and conflicting reports and all that kind of stuff. So it's really difficult to sift through all of it. And then now with 100 plus years, 130 years almost of analyzing and overanalyzing and people coming out with new suspects and documentaries saying, here we finally unveiled who the Ripper is. It's hard to separate fact from fiction and myth from reality, so hopefully we'll be able to do that here.
They interviewed thousands, investigated hundreds, and developed numerous theories along the way. In the words of Inspector Frederick Abeline, "Theories. We were lost almost in theories. There were so many of them."
But he had his own theory.
In an effort to narrow down the search, the police used a primitive form of criminal profiling. The idea was to analyze the available evidence to try and gauge what sort of person had committed the crimes. This profile was prepared by Dr. Thomas Bond, and he described the Ripper as a strong, middle-aged man with an inoffensive appearance who dressed respectably. Bond's most controversial assessment was that the killer possessed, quote, "no scientific nor anatomical knowledge." This stood in direct opposition to the opinions of his peers, most of whom ascribed the Ripper with at least a basic understanding of anatomy. Based on the witness accounts, the Ripper was a man of average height with a medium to stout build in his late 20s to mid-30s. He wore dark clothes, including a hat of some sort, and had a mustache. But this sort of aggregation or tabulation of accounts can be quite deceptive.
So this is really cool how he's done this here, laying it all out, because this really allows you to look at it and decide, just from looking at all this, you can figure the guy's most likely around 30 years old, because it seems like that's about where everybody's got him. of the eyewitnesses. He's probably around 5'6", based on the averages. Think about it. If you walk past somebody on the street in the dark and caught them briefly, a glimpse of them, and didn't really even know that you were going to have to remember them until a day or two later, are you going to remember exactly how tall they are, exactly how old you think they are, and think of all the reasons why people look older or younger than they really are? So, you got to kind of take that average of all of that stuff. It seems almost certain the guy had a mustache, because pretty much everybody who described facial hair describes that. The hat, the dress, things like that, the complexion.
Not only are many details inconsistent, but they could be describing entirely different people. For all we know, none of the witnesses ever laid eyes on Jack the Ripper.
But somebody
So
did.
much is up for debate that one can build a case against almost any suspect. Some have even entertained the possibility that the Ripper was a woman or possibly a man disguised as a woman.
No chance.
While Jill or Jackie the Ripper is an interesting theory, it has failed to achieve any widespread support.
Because it's ridiculous.
What is rarely in dispute is that the Ripper was either a resident of or otherwise familiar with the East End. After all, he managed to narrowly evade capture on multiple occasions, which implies intimate knowledge of byways and patrol routes. He likely had some form of employment, as the murders were committed around weekends and public holidays, and he may have had some degree of anatomical knowledge. With this unshakable profile in hand, let's take a closer look at a few suspects.
All right.
The question is, where do we even begin?
So with the suspects, there's some that you can just rule out right away. I mean, the theory that Prince Albert Victor, who was in line for the throne, he was the eldest son of the Prince of Wales, is ridiculous. He has a solid alibi. He wasn't anywhere near some of the murders. That's the whole from hell theory, which is that Albert Victor secretly wed one of these women and got her pregnant and all this stuff, and that they were ritually killing off the people involved. And even if they don't say that he was the Ripper directly, that he had like his doctor, Sir William Gall, do the murders. It's stupid and ridiculous. So ones like that you can toss out right away. There are others that you can look at and say, I don't think so, but there's no like easy provable alibi that says can't possibly be them.
According to criminal profiler and FBI special agent John Douglas, the Ripper was not only a local, but was likely interviewed by the police.
Agree.
If Douglas is correct, the Ripper might be someone we've already met. Either a witness or a person close to one of the victims.
And it's important, the witness thing is a strong thing because very often the very people that are closest to one of the victims ends up, if you remember Silence of the Lambs, it's fictional obviously, but how they end up finding the killer is that they figure out that the first victim was somebody he knew. And that all the other ones kind of came after that. And so it's a very distinct possibility that the killer did know at least one of the victims.
What about John Richardson, the witness in the Chapman case who sat down on the backyard steps to trim a piece of leather from his boot?
Nope.
Richardson was indeed suspected by the police, but they found, quote, not a shred of evidence against him. His mother also lived on the premises, so he had good reason to be there. What about George Hutchinson, the witness who followed Mary Jane Kelly after she was accosted by a well-dressed client?
So I'm going to just kind of throw out on a scale from 1 to 10, 1, 0 chance he's the Ripper, and 10, absolutely the Ripper with each one of these. Hutchinson, I'd put it about a 3 or 4.
Hutchinson never clarified his motivation for shadowing the couple. He merely stated that he was surprised to see a man so well dressed in the company of a woman like Kelly. Was he surprised because he was concerned? Was he jealous? Was it about money? After all, Hutchinson was broke, and the client appeared to be wealthy.
So I'll say this. People lie to the police for a lot of reasons that have nothing to do with them actually being involved in the crime they're being questioned about. Hutchinson's a perfect example of this. Hutchinson's definitely lying or covering something up or being misleading somehow, but I don't think he's a suspect because of that.
Perhaps he waited outside the court with the intention of mugging this well-dressed client. There are many question marks surrounding Hutchinson. He has never been positively identified, so next to nothing is known about his life. This makes it very difficult to build a strong case against him.
And this is another important thing that he brings up here, not just with the witnesses, but also with some of the victims, especially Mary Jane Kelly. They used aliases all the time, and we really don't know for sure in some of these cases. In fact, I want to say that it was Catherine Eddowes, one of the double event victims, actually went by the name Mary Ann Kelly at one time. I think, was it Catherine Eddowes? Yeah, she was the one that was arrested that night. And I believe that when she was arrested, the night she was killed, she had given the name Mary Ann Kelly as her name. So Mary Jane Kelly, for example, probably not her name for the last victim. So that makes it really difficult.
Hutchinson was interrogated by the police, but ultimately convinced Inspector Frederick Abeline that he was telling the truth. But not every witness attracted such attention from the police. Take, for instance, Charles Cross, the man who discovered the body of Mary Ann Nichols.
All right, so if we're going, and he's also known as Charles Lechmere, I think, if we're going on my scale of 1 to 10, I'd put Cross at a 7. I don't think he's the Ripper, but I think there's a strong case to be made that he could be. And there are a lot of people that will argue he was.
On the morning of August the 31st, Charles Cross left his home on Doveton Street and headed for work. When he turned into Bucks Row, he happened upon the body of Mary Ann Nichols. Moments later, he was joined by Robert Paul, and events transpired as previously described. Despite his proximity to the crime, Cross appears to have escaped suspicion from both the press and the police. He was evidently seen as the innocent passerby that he appeared to be. But in recent years, that perception has been challenged. The argument is that Cross was in the act of committing the murder when he was interrupted by the approaching footsteps of Paul. Cross...
Plausible, but I don't think there's any evidence that's the case. Oh, I think I muted it.
The injuries inflicted upon Nichols would be consistent with an interruption, as they were less severe than those of later victims.
Yeah, but that's also easily explained by the fact that this is the first, arguably the first victim, and so he's escalating.
What's interesting about Cross is that he likely testified under a false name. He claimed to be employed as a carman, and his address was given as 22 Doveton Street. But surviving records show that in 1888, this address was occupied by a man named Charles Lechmere. Lechmere was also employed as a carman, and on at least one occasion went by the name Charles Cross, as it was the surname of his stepfather. It is now widely believed that Charles Lechmere was the man who appeared at the inquest, and that he assumed the name of his stepfather when he testified. His motivation for doing so has been the source of much speculation.
Yeah, it could be as simple as, I don't really want my name in the press and I don't want people to know it was me. It might not be anything, nefarious that he's trying to do here.
Was he trying to conceal his identity, or was it merely a force of habit? After all, contemporary examples of people doing the exact same thing are not difficult to
Billy
find.
the Kid did the same thing with his name.
The most compelling evidence against Lechmere is that his morning commute between home and work roughly coincides with the time and place of the murders.
Yeah, but that said, is he going to murder someone on the way to work? Because even if we assume, as is likely the case, that the Ripper strangles the woman to death first before he cuts him, which means there's no arterial spray, so it's much less likely he gets blood on him. Still, there's no way you avoid getting blood on yourself. So that's why I think it's got to be a butcher, and we'll get to that, because they're likely to not be seen as suspicious having blood on them. But he worked as a car man. So I don't think he would kill these women on his way to work. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Except for the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, who were killed on a Sunday, the only day when Lechmere would have been free from work. Not only that, but all the murders were committed around weekends and public holidays. Why would a man who supposedly timed the murders with his morning commute gravitate towards days of rest? In any case, Lechmere's mother lived a few blocks south of Berners Street, the neighborhoods around which is also where Lechmere spent his childhood. As such, it's speculated that Stride and Eddowes were killed after Lechmere paid a late-night visit to his mother. While he claimed to be employed at a delivery firm known as Pickford's, there are no surviving records of his employment. If he did work for Pickford's, there is a fair chance that he delivered meat and would thus have been exposed to slaughter and blood on a daily basis. Lechmere remained in East London.
But again, that's speculation. We don't know for sure that that's what he was transporting.
Until his death in 1920 at the age of 71. While there is no evidence of Lechmere ever being suspected by the police, it is difficult to believe that he was completely overlooked. Many case files have not survived, so any doubts investigators might have had could have long since disappeared. Now, a witness who definitely attracted attention was Joseph Barnett.
And Barnett's another one that I'll give a 7 to. Barnett fits the profile. If you look at, they've done, like the modern FBI has done a profile, like, the modern profiles they do on Jack the Ripper. Barnett fits their profile. He obviously is connected to Mary Jane Kelly, which there's a lot of questions about why is Mary Jane Kelly so different. She's much younger than the other victims. She's indoors. She's just horribly brutalized. Is that only because he had more time indoors, or is it because there was something about her, like he knew her? And that also would fit the Barnett profile. I would put Barnett slightly ahead of Lechmere on my list, but still not the one I think is the Ripper.
Joseph Barnett was the man who lived with Mary Jane Kelly up until a few days before the murder. He and Kelly had supposedly met around April of 1887, and they eventually moved to 13 Miller's Court. Barnett was employed as a fish porter, but for reasons unknown, he lost his job between July and August of 1888.
Now, some people argue that his job working with fish made it ideal for him then to be cutting up women, but there's really no comparison between cutting up a fish and cutting up a human being. You can see that comparison between a butcher, for example, who works with pigs or even cattle, but not with fish. There are other things that make him a possible suspect, though.
From that point onwards, the couple struggled to pay rent, and Kelly resorted back to prostitution. Now, those who believe that Barnett was the Ripper view his loss of employment as a turning point. The argument is that Barnett was so overcome with guilt and anguish for driving Kelly back to prostitution that he went on a murder spree, murdering one local prostitute after another in a desperate attempt to frighten Kelly off the streets. While most of this is pure speculation, it is true that Barnett disapproved of Kelly's prostitution. You may recall that Barnett separated from Kelly on October the 30th because he disliked the prostitutes with whom she associated. Kelly never went on the streets when she lived with me. She would never have gone wrong again, and I should never have left if it had not been for the prostitutes stopping by the house.
And so, of course, the other difference you have here is that Mary Jane Kelly has her own residence. It was small. It was basically a tiny room. It was really, really small. It was smaller than my closet. But it was her own residence. She wasn't staying at a common lodging house. She wasn't having to worry about nightly rent. So she did have at least that going for her.
This might further explain why Kelly was the Ripper's final and most viciously mutilated victim.
It would explain
the implication being that Barnett felt rejected by Kelly and wanted revenge for the breakup. According to Barnett, he did pay Kelly a visit on the evening of November the 8th, but they had parted on, quote, friendly terms.
Which, whether or not that was true, that's what he's going to say, right?
He then supposedly went home, played a card game until 12:30 before going to bed. Now, Kelly is presumed to have died in the early hours of November the 9th, so Barnett could have returned to Miller's Court sometime after midnight. While the police did subject him to 4 hours of interrogation, Barnett was ultimately released without charge. Then there's the matter of the locked door. When the police arrived at Miller's Court, they had to force the door open with a pickaxe. This raised an important question. How did the killer lock the door behind him? According to Barnett, the key to room 13 had been missing for some time. Because of this, he and Kelly would, quote, open the door by reaching through the broken window. The door was said to be equipped with a, quote, catch lock, and evidently locked itself upon being closed. If that's true, mystery solved.
Yep.
But even if the door was not self-locking, there's still an obvious solution. All the killer would have had to do is observe Kelly using the window trick and then employ that same technique to fasten the door upon leaving. But those who favor Barnett as the Ripper offer yet another solution. The key never went missing.
He had it the whole
time.
Instead,
Barnett is said to have stolen the key and then used it on the night of the murder. These solutions are all equally valid, and it's impossible to know which one is correct. There is a slight variation of this theory which states that Barnett did murder Kelly, but was not the Ripper. Instead, he merely emulated the Ripper to deflect attention away from himself.
I could buy that sooner than I could buy that he was the Ripper. You could argue that it was a different killer. I don't think it was, but it's certainly possible. And I would certainly consider that more plausible than the fact that he had killed all the other women as well.
Once again, this is pure speculation, but the murder of Kelly did somewhat differ from the rest in that it was committed indoors. Barnett remained in the East End until his death in 1926 at the age of 68. While it's only natural for suspicion to fall upon witnesses and acquaintances, Victorian detectives did pursue other lines of inquiry. One prominent theory was that the Ripper suffered from insanity, and a prime suspect in that category is Aaron Kosminski.
Now this is going to be interesting because there's not even a really... Well, let me let him describe this first, and then I'll tell you what I think is the case with this one.
The Whitechapel murders investigation was overseen by numerous high-ranking officers within the Metropolitan Police. One of them was Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson. Upon his retirement, Anderson repeatedly and unequivocally stated that Jack the Ripper had been identified. There was no doubt whatever as to the identity of the criminal. Without disclosing the name of the suspect, Anderson described him as a, quote, low-class Polish Jew who was, quote, safely caged in an asylum. He'd been identified by a witness who was described as, quote, the only person who ever had a good view of the murderer. This unnamed witness had supposedly refused to testify because the suspect was, quote, a fellow Jew.
Yep.
I am almost tempted to disclose the identity of the murderer, but no public benefit would result from such a course.
And you'll see he also refers to knowing who wrote the Jack the Ripper letter, the Dear Boss letter. So he talked about knowing both of those things. And I will agree with this. The reason that I discount some of the other ones that are common favorites right now are that I think anybody that the police interviewed extensively and dismissed as a suspect are very unlikely to have been the suspect. Number two, I think that the Ripper was almost certainly a Polish Jew. There's a number of reasons for that. The letter being one, the From Hell letter, the eyewitness accounts, the area in which this is happening. I think he was also probably someone who worked as either a barber or as a slaughterhouse butcher of some kind. And that's kind of the direction that this one goes, but there's a catch to it.
While Anderson never revealed the name of the suspect, his colleagues were a bit more forthcoming. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson revealed that his surname was Kosminski.
But not Aaron Kosminski, just Kosminski.
Their high-ranking officer, Melville McNaughton, described Kosminski as a homicidal and misogynistic resident of Whitechapel. Surviving records show that an Aaron Kosminski was admitted to a psychiatric hospital in 1891.
Not him.
Aaron was indeed from Poland, he was Jewish, and had lived in Whitechapel. He suffered from auditory hallucinations and a paranoid fear of being fed by others. He was trained as a barber, but had, quote, not attempted any kind of work for years. It's unclear when his mental health began to decline, but upon being institutionalized, Aaron was deemed to be harmless. He was, quote, quiet and well-behaved, and, quote, apathetic as a rule. Only on rare occasions would he get, quote, excited and violent. However, before his confinement, Aaron had once threatened his sister with a knife. The case against him largely hinges upon the claims made by Anderson, Swanson, and McNaughton, especially the claim that an unnamed witness identified a suspect named Kosminski. But the descriptions of that suspect are not entirely consistent with Aaron Kosminski. For instance, McNaughton stated that the suspect had been, quote, removed to a lunatic asylum about March 1889.
Yeah, see, not
Aaron
the same
was
guy.
first confined in 1891. Swanson wrote that the suspect had been, quote, sent to the asylum and died shortly afterwards. Aaron was still alive at the time and spent nearly 3 decades in psychiatric care. As such, it is possible that the suspect Kosminski was someone other than Aaron Kosminski.
Yep.
It's also possible that these inconsistencies were mere lapses in memory. After all, these events were recounted years or even decades after the fact, and McNaughton even confessed to writing solely from memory. Regardless of the suspect's true identity, Anderson was the only one who seemed convinced of his guilt. McNaughton ultimately favored a different suspect and stated that, quote, many homicidal maniacs were suspected, but no shadow of proof could be thrown on any one.
Because there were just many homicidal maniacs living in Whitechapel at the time. Probably true.
Inspector Edmund Reed was of the same opinion. Now we have Sir Robert Anderson saying that Jack the Ripper was a Jew. That I challenge him to prove. I challenge anyone to prove that there was a tittle of evidence against man, woman, or child. So when Anderson wrote that there was, quote, no doubt whatever as to the identity of the criminal, he merely expressed his personal opinion. There was in fact ample doubt and no consensus amongst the police.
Fair.
But in recent years, Aaron Kosminski has been resurrected as a prime suspect due to a controversial DNA analysis. Okay, so back in 1888, Acting Sergeant Amos Simpson is said to have stolen a blood-stained shawl from the crime scene of Catherine Eddowes.
Which we still have.
The shawl was then passed down from one generation to the next before being submitted for DNA testing in 2011.
But think about how many people have touched this thing in over 100 years. And the odds that you're going to pull from that DNA related to the killer after all this time. It's next to impossible.
DNA samples were extracted from the shawl and then compared against maternal descendants of Eddowes and Kosminski.
And what they mean by that is this. Your mitochondrial DNA, which is the Y chromosome, or the X chromosome, I'm sorry. Quick science lesson here. Males are XY, females are XX. The father determines whether or not you're a male or female by passing on either the Y chromosome or the X chromosome. The X chromosome can only be inherited through the female line, or through the male then female. It's complicated. Sum it up this way. A woman who has a daughter and a daughter and a daughter and a daughter and a daughter, you can go down 8, 9, 10 generations of daughter, mother, mother like that. That female descendant through an all-female line is going to have the same mitochondrial DNA as the woman back 10 generations. And her sons are going to have that same DNA as well, but not her son's sons. See what I mean? So if Catherine Eddowes has a daughter, they can compare that, and they can do the same with female family members of this Kosminski. It's how they figured out who Richard III's body was Richard III, because they were able to compare his mitochondrial DNA to a female line descendant of his sister who would have the same mitochondrial DNA. So anyway.
In both cases, it was a match. If the subsequent news coverage is to be believed, the mystery has now been, quote, definitively solved. Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. But as you can imagine, it's never quite that simple. First of all, the provenance or chain of custody of the shawl is severely lacking.
Yep.
There is no evidence of a shawl being found at the crime scene, nor is there any evidence of Simpson ever being at the crime scene. Furthermore, a destitute woman like Eddowes is unlikely to have owned such an expensive item.
Can we talk about, though, the fact that there were this many items found at that crime scene? I mean, I can't imagine she had all this stuff on her. Some of it was probably just laying there, but that's a ridiculously high number of things for somebody to be carrying around, including a knife, by the way.
Second of all, the type of DNA used to identify Eddowes and Kosminski was mitochondrial DNA, the powerhouse of the cell. This type of DNA is passed down through the female line and is not unique to any one individual. Thousands can share the same mitochondrial DNA, which means it can't be used to pinpoint a specific person. In the words of a geneticist, based on mitochondrial DNA, one can only exclude a suspect. So to say that the mystery has been definitively solved is widely inaccurate. There's still plenty of room for doubt. So to recap, a suspect named Kosminski was identified by an unknown witness. This was enough to convince at least one senior officer of his guilt. That suspect may have been Aaron Kosminski, a man who was largely non-violent but once threatened his sister with a knife. Aaron can neither be incriminated nor eliminated by the DNA evidence. He spent the rest of his life in psychiatric care and died in 1919 at the age of 53.
I want to dive a little deeper on this one for a minute, because I want to explore why I think this is on the right track, at the very least, of who the killer was. Okay, so one of the people that is listed in the suspect list is David Cohen. Now, it's important to note, and I think they mentioned this in here, that Cohen is basically, David Cohen is like John Doe. When you have a Jewish suspect in Victorian London, they would use that name in lieu of having a real name. So let me just read this to you. A 23-year-old Polish Jew whose incarceration at Colney Hatch, same place as Aaron Kosminski, on 7th December 1888, so a month after the Mary Jane Kelly murder, which I think is a vital piece of evidence, because I am convinced that Jack the Ripper either died, got put in an asylum, or was arrested on some other charge, rather than just simply stopped. I'm not saying it can't happen that way, but in this type of murder, I think it's super unlikely he just stopped. He's an unmarried tailor. He was violently antisocial, a poor East End local. He was suggested as a suspect by our author and ripperologist Martin Fido in the book Crimes, Detection, and Death of Jack the Ripper in 1987. Fido claimed the name David Cohen was used at the time to refer to a Jewish immigrant who either could not positively be identified or whose name was too difficult for police to spell. In the same fashion John Doe is used today. He identified Cohen with leather apron, which most people say is John Pizer, and speculated that Cohen's true identity was Nathan Kaminsky. Now that's key. Kosminski, Kaminsky, a bootmaker living in Whitechapel who had been treated at one time for syphilis, which would it causes severe breakdowns in a person's brain in the end stages. And he obviously is in the end stages because he dies on October 1889, who could not be traced after mid-1888, the same time that Cohen appears. Fido believed the police officials confused the name Kaminsky with Kosminski, resulting in the wrong man coming under suspicion. Cohen exhibited violent, destructive tendencies while at the asylum, unlike Aaron Kosminski, who did not demonstrate those kinds of things and had to be restrained. He died at the asylum on October 1889. In his book, The Cases That Haunt Us, former FBI criminal profiler John Douglas has asserted that behavioral clues gathered from the murders all point to a person, quote, known to the police as David Cohen or someone very much like him. I will say this. By the time he goes to the to the asylum, he's gotten violent and uncontrollable. That does not describe the man that witnesses see with these women before they died. So he either had progressively gotten worse, or it's not him. Because this was a guy who looked respectable and was able to gain these women's confidence. So he could not have been crazy, so to speak. So that causes me to back off a little bit, but I think that this is kind of the right track as far as who the killer was. Whether it's exactly that person, I don't know, but I think that's the direction we probably need to look.
Kosminski was not the only suspect advanced by a high-ranking officer. A completely different suspect who still falls into the same category is Francis Tumblety.
He gets about a 4 for me. Suspect 4.
2 days before the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, an American physician named Francis Tumblety was arrested in London. As you can probably tell from this photograph, Tumblety was quite an eccentric character. Yeah. He was born in Ireland around 1833, but was raised in the United States. From an early age, Tumblety gained a reputation for being a medicaster or quack doctor. He engaged in all sorts of medically dubious practices.
At one point, I think he was friends with one of the conspirators in the plot to kidnap and then eventually murder Abraham Lincoln.
And advertised himself as the Indian herb doctor. He promised to cure anything from dyspepsia and scurvy to cancer and blindness using nothing but medicinal herbs. When he was not posing as a doctor, Tumblety was busy running from the law. He was either accused or convicted for crimes like theft and assault, attempt to induce a miscarriage, and manslaughter of a patient. He was even implicated in the assassination of US President Abraham Lincoln, but was ultimately cleared of suspicion. Now, in the early 1860s, Tumblety is alleged to have hosted a lavish dinner party in Washington. Only men were invited to this dinner, and Tumblety had supposedly expressed fierce hatred of women. Furthermore, he showcased a cabinet in his office in which he stored a vast collection of jars filled with anatomical specimens, some of which were said to contain the wombs of, quote, every class of woman. In 1869, Tumblety ventured across the Atlantic and visited England for the first time. By his own admission, he roamed the streets of London until he became familiar with every part of it. He advertised himself as the great American doctor and had a few skirmishes with the police. After a few more voyages between the old world and the new, Tumblety found himself in London in the autumn of 1888. The purpose of his visit and whereabouts at the time of the murders are completely unknown. Tumblety never stayed in one place for long and made frequent use of false names. There is a story of a mysterious lodger leaving behind a blood-stained shirt near the murder site of Elizabeth Stride.
Now, the lodger is a fascinating what-if about all this. I'm not going to get into it, but there's something there that's pretty interesting.
This supposedly happened on the night of the murder, and some believe that this lodger was Francis Tumblety. But there is no firm evidence of that, and the entire incident is fraught with uncertainty. What we do know is that Tumblety was arrested in London on November the 7th. According to the press, as well as Tumblety himself, he was arrested on suspicion of being Jack the Ripper. 2 days later, Mary Jane Kelly was found brutally murdered, and it's unclear whether Tumblety was still in custody or had already been released on bail.
You would have to think, I'm not saying it's definite, that if he was arrested on suspicion of being the Ripper and had gotten out on bail, that somebody was watching this guy. I would like to think so.
Nevertheless, he was ultimately charged with 4 counts of gross indecency, which had nothing to do with the murders. But Tumblety had no intention of standing trial. Instead, he made his way across the English Channel, boarded a steamship under a false name, and fled back to America. He was pursued by detectives and kept under surveillance, but his offenses were, quote, not extraditable.
See, that's the thing. If they followed the man back to America, I guarantee you they were following him 2 days after he was arrested, so I just don't see it.
As such, Tumblety remained in the United States and never returned to England. So to recap, Francis Tumblety was a misogynistic medicaster who was in London at the time of the murders. He even showcased a collection of wombs, and the Ripper did indeed extract the womb from 2 of his victims. I mean, he sounds like the perfect suspect. Perhaps a bit too perfect.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem. And the other thing is that part of the argument that people make about Tumblety is based on some of the Ripper letters being genuine, because some people argue that some of the phrases in those are Americanisms, or even phrases that people of Irish descent would use. And he was born in Ireland, grew up in America, so they kind of tie him in that way. A lot of circumstantial evidence that could point in his direction, but nothing that sells me on him.
There is no doubt that Tumblety was in London in 1888, but the claim that he was a misogynistic collector of human body parts is extremely dubious. It can be traced back to a single article from December of 1888, featuring an interview with a man named Charles Dunham. Dunham had a long history of spreading misinformation and has been described as a pathological liar, a forger, and a conman. He was even convicted of perjury. As such, there is every reason to believe that this story is a complete fabrication. Furthermore,
so for me, of the suspects he's put out there right now, Kosminski, not Aaron Kosminski, but Kosminski is number 1 for me out of the ones he's mentioned. I would put Lechmere second, Barnett right below him, and then probably Tumblety after that.
Tumblety was both older and taller than the men described by most witnesses.
Way too old.
Tumblety was said to be, quote, an enormous man who liked to dress in flamboyant and militaristic outfits.
If a 55-year-old 6'2" guy was the suspect, that would have stood out to people. Absolutely.
It's difficult to imagine a tall, pompous American sneaking around the streets of Whitechapel virtually undetected.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it's unclear which, if any, of the witness accounts can be trusted.
Yeah, but none of them said that.
Then there's the matter of the rings. You may recall that 2 brass rings were stolen from the body of Annie Chapman. It's suspected that the rings were taken by the Ripper to be kept as trophies. Now, upon his death in 1903, Tumblety left behind a quite impressive estate. But among his many valuable possessions were a pair of inexpensive imitation rings. Could they have been the same rings taken from the body of Chapman? It's possible. It's also impossible to prove. Chief Inspector John Littlechild regarded Tumblety as a, quote, very likely suspect. And it's not difficult to see why. If the many rumors about him are to be believed, Tumblety had both opportunity and motive to commit the murders. But therein lies the problem. Much of what we know about Tumblety is founded upon unsubstantiated rumors. Tumblety himself was an attention-seeking charlatan with no qualms about lies and deception. With a suspect like that, one can never be certain where the lies end and the truth begins. To theorize about the identity of Jack the Ripper is to navigate a minefield of hearsay, sophistry, and contradictions. Entire encyclopedias have been dedicated to the compilation of suspects, and with every passing year, they seem to grow ever more expansive. Even though there are hundreds of potential suspects, only a dozen or so are worth more than a brief consideration.
Let's talk about James Maybrick for a second here. The first research paper I wrote on Jack the Ripper, I wrote right about the time that the book, The Diary of Jack the Ripper, came out. So supposedly, something along the lines, I'll try to sum it up as quickly as I can. People are doing some renovation work at a house in Liverpool in England. And in the floorboards of this house, which belonged to James Maybrick in the 1880s, who was a wealthy cotton merchant, who was often in London on weekends and around holidays, they find this diary that describes in detail the murders and what was going on between Maybrick and his wife, Florence, who was much younger than him. And in the end, he signs it. I give my name, so history do tell what love can do to a gentle man born. And he signs it Jack the Ripper. And basically, this diary purports to be James Maybrick, who is under the influence of arsenic. Now, arsenic in very small doses could be taken as a drug and have a similar effect to LSD. But the problem was that arsenic was such a powerful jolt to the system that to go off of it, the withdrawal would often kill you. And supposedly that's what happens to James Maybrick, is that he can no longer get his supply of arsenic. He dies from the withdrawal. What we know is that Maybrick's wife, Florence, who was an American, was convicted of his murder because they found the arsenic in his system. That is a historical fact. She went to jail for a couple decades, I think, until she was eventually let go. And the argument in this diary was that he wasn't poisoning her, but she was cheating on him, or that she wasn't poisoning him, she was cheating on him, and that was why Maybrick starts killing prostitutes, because he says his wife's a whore, and he's going to stick it to all the other whores. And as proof that it's true, there are two pieces of evidence that people like to point to. One of them is in the right contrast of the picture of Mary Jane Kelly's body, it looks like written in blood on the back wall are the letters FM. And in the diary, in writing about the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, who he argues he killed because she looked like his wife, and that's why she was younger and prettier than all the other victims, he says an initial here, an initial there will tell of the whoring mother, which is what he called his wife. He called her a whore for cheating on him. So he was sticking it to Mary Jane Kelly because she reminded him of his wife. And the reason he stopped killing after that is because of the arsenic withdrawal, stuff like that. So there's a lot of arguments about the diary, whether it's true or not. I should mention the other piece of evidence is that this pocket watch turns up that has the initials of the victims written into it. So like AC and, Marianne Nichols, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly, stuff like that. They haven't been able to disprove that the pocket watch is genuine in terms of it looks like it was those initials were carved a long time ago. So they haven't been able to prove it as a modern forgery. There's conflicting arguments about the diary, whether or not it can be proved as a modern forgery. Some tests have said, yes, it's a forgery. Others have said, if it's a forgery that dates back to that time period. I tend to believe that latter camp, which is that if it is indeed a forgery, and there's a good chance it was forged at the time. The biggest problem, of course, is that Maybrick's handwriting doesn't match that in the diary. But I can't get into all of that, but it's a fascinating thing to at least look into. And that was what I wrote my research paper on, is at the time arguing that James Maybrick was Jack the Ripper. He's still kind of the intriguing suspect to me. I don't think he was Jack the Ripper, but he's the most fascinating case study for me that I still find very, very interesting. The other very common suspect people talk about is George Chapman, who was a Polish Jew who was known as Severin Kozlowski. They talk about him in the movie and the TV show Ripper Street. They show him at the end. He was convicted of poisoning several wives at the end of his life. But if he was Jack the Ripper, he completely changed his MO and lived for years without killing anybody. So I think he's unlikely, but he's another common suspect people like to point to. So anyway, let's finish this up.
Some of the more sensational contenders include famous authors and artists, as well as high-ranking officers and members of the royal family. But these grand conspiracies and elaborate deceptions seem hopelessly contrived against the sheer simplicity of a suspect like Charles Lechmere, an unassuming delivery man on his way to work. Personally, I remain unconvinced that Jack the Ripper has even been identified as a suspect. The few covered in this video are probable candidates, but it's still possible to make persuasive arguments against them. The same is true of all those left out by necessity. None of them can offer anything more than ambiguity and circumstance. With a suspect pool in the hundreds, that might seem improbable. But London was the largest city in the world, home to the largest port in the world. It was a city of millions, with a large population of poorly documented drifters. It's not difficult to imagine One lowly sailor, butcher, medic, soldier, barber, merchant.
Could easily have been in town for a couple of months, left on a ship, and disappeared into history. Absolutely possible. I still think the police had an idea and interviewed multiple times the suspect.
Blending into the slums of Whitechapel like a grain of sand.
We'll never know. Never know for sure. All right, very interesting stuff. Let me know in the comment section below, who is your suspect? Who do you think was Jack the Ripper? Fascinating stuff. And like I said, check out that other link that I threw up in there for you to check out. And we'll see you again tomorrow with some new material. Thanks for watching.